Thank you all for joining this talk on climate, climate benefits, climate costs, and COVID-19. So we've heard a lot about how there may be a silver lining here, right? At least pollution is down. And yeah, pollution is down. Environmental effects are by and large positive in a very, very short-term, narrow sense. Local air pollution in lots of different places is down. Given that local air pollution kills somewhere between 3 and 6 million people per year, every year, well, fewer people are dying now because of air pollution. We can see the bottom of the canals in Venice. There are fish in Venice. There are jellyfish swimming in Venice, and so on and so forth. So yes, it might in fact be good for pollution, air pollution. It is not good for climate, for climate change. And just to give you an extreme example of those who try to tout that particular news or silver lining, as it were, by now they're in fact peer-reviewed papers in a proper scientific journal, not actually typically a bad one. The title, COVID-19 Pandemic and Environmental Pollution, a Blessing in Disguise. And just take a look at the concluding sentence. Ignore the grammatical error, so I guess that already tells you how hastily this was put together. But here's the concluding sentence. This positive impact on the environment, I believe, may be temporary, but governments and individuals should learn from this lockdown on how to reduce pollution on a long-term basis. And just to be clear, no, they should not. There is no way to take this as a guide for how we should address climate change. Climate policy, if anything, looks like more economic activity, more action, more investments. There is 100 tons of steel in every wind turbine. Well, that means more economic growth on the one hand. It also means more employment. And once we get to the good news portion of this, yes, there is in fact a silver lining here if and when we get around to figuring out how to send people back to work once the public health pandemic aspects of this allow us to do so. That may well be a silver lining, right? We've all heard about the Green New Deal. Sure, but that is a very, very different story from saying that the crash in economic activity now is in fact good news. Yes, I've written about this. Title is overly long, but it pretty much conveys the point. True climate success looks like more action, not less. Okay, point one. Now, there are, in fact, some real parallels between COVID on the one hand and climate on the other. In many ways, COVID is climate change at warp speed. It is such a rapid increase, exponential increase in daily cases, that exactly this exponential growth basically dwarfs everything. With climate too, it's not about levels. It's not where we are today. It is not about the 1 degree centigrade of average global warming to date. Yes, that is bad enough, and it should have prompted us to act a long time ago. But it is not about the levels that drives our concern about climate change. It is the growth rates. It is where things would be heading. Why is that? Because it is all about the increase, the rapid increase in damages, climate impacts associated with this relatively small increase in temperatures. So by now, we've all heard about R naught as one of these epidemiological figures that matters a lot. Well, a small difference, a relatively small difference in this one figure, essentially how many people you personally infect on average, every individual infects on average. Well, a relatively small difference in that number results in ginormous differences in the eventual impact. So just to give you a sort of a quick sense of this, well, after 10 interactions, if each person only affects one other person, we're still left with one infection, right? Each person infects one other person on average. If it's two people, each person infects 2 times 2 times 2, that 10 times is around 1,000. If that, on the other hand, is 3, not that big a difference in how many individuals each person affects. Well, after 10 interactions, we are at 60,000 people infected. A huge difference in outcome when it comes to R naught infection rates for COVID. Well, back to climate, essentially the exact same thing happening here. 1 degree centigrade of warming, we're already there, by the way, right? The globe has warmed on average around 1 degree centigrade, 1.8, 2 degrees Fahrenheit by now. Yes, that is bad enough. It is nothing compared to 1.5, 2 degrees, 3 degrees even, and of course, climate change doesn't end there, right? 4, 5, 6 degrees. So yes, it is all about exponential growth. It is all about what happens to growth rates, not to levels. There are some other parallels here too on how bad things would get, but let me shift gears ever so slightly here and try to look at parallels in what to actually do about COVID, or for that matter, climate change. Back to a picture that many of us might have seen by now. It's been all over social media over the past couple of weeks. So that's a beach in Florida, 2 adjacent counties in Florida. One closed its beaches, the other one didn't. Right? And you can clearly see the county line. Yeah, there are a couple of cops here patrolling one, but one beach is empty. The other one is full. Now, by the way, that is not to say that it may not be a bad idea overall to start thinking about reopening public parks, beaches, as long as people stay 6 feet apart, which here in many ways they clearly don't. The point I'd like to get across here is it is all about policy. It is all about institutions, governments that actually makes the difference. It's not you and me as individuals trying to do the right thing. Yes, as usual, that's part of it too, of course. Social norms and so on and so forth. All of that is important. It's always good to do the right thing, just for the sake of doing the right thing. On the other hand, when it comes to solving something like COVID, or for that matter, climate change, it is all about policy. It is very, very difficult to see how individual action, you and I doing the right thing, is going to make the difference here in the end. It's about policy, it's about institutions. That frankly is also the story around the silver lining. It was only a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago by now, that the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, had its very first lead author meeting ever. Couple hundred, 250 or so lead authors meeting virtually. They had never done that before. It's always been, well, at least half of them flying halfway around the world to meet and then write those massive IPCC assessment reports. In many ways, there's no reason to believe that that shouldn't continue. Speaking of good news coming out of COVID, sure, but it is the institution. In this case, it's the IPCC. High energy physicists, the one linked to CERN in Switzerland, they've been meeting for about a decade or so, hundreds, couple thousand of them on a semi-regular basis, having teleconferences over Zoom, over online. It works. It's productive. It cuts down on emissions. But it is the institution that needs to set the tone. Right? You could very easily see, let's say, the Regional Widget Sales Association, which was supposed to have its sales appreciation meeting in Cleveland this summer. Well, that just got canceled. Next year, it'll be Barcelona or bust. Why not? Right? Saved a bit of money this year. Next year, why not go all out? And it's examples like this over and over again, where it becomes pretty clear that it is not the individual, it's policy, it's government, it's the institution. And yes, of course, government reacts typically to what we as individuals want, but that's it might be a political statement these days to say this, but it really ought not be to say, if you want to influence policy, go vote. If you want to do something about climate change, go vote. Which leads me to the last point before turning it over to discussion Q&A, which is, yes, climate is in fact a much, much bigger problem than COVID. Doesn't feel like this right now, I can tell you. Certainly not from personal experience right about now. But when it comes to the actual impacts of the known knowns in Don Rumsfeld speak here, right? The stuff we can quantify, the stuff we know that will happen. Well, climate change, it might take a while, right? Plenty of things that hit home already, also for climate change, but we have seen nothing compared to what would happen over decades and centuries hence. And yes, what we do today, how we act, how we design policy today influences that outcome. It is not just about lowering costs by acting sooner. We actually get to, frankly, an entirely different outcome. Right? Speaking here, sitting in New York City, right? Had we shut down New York something like a week or 10 days earlier, we would have cut down cases, deaths associated with COVID by something like tenfold. Right? Instead of 80,000 or so, we would be looking at a tenth of that. Not just a difference in costs, economic costs, a huge difference in the final outcome as well. And yes, at the end of the day, it is all about those systemic risks. It is all about how do we as society, as government, decide to tackle the really big ones. And yes, I might be biased here, but I would certainly count climate change as the big one vis-a-vis any of these possible risks, uncertainties that we are facing right about now. So with that, let me turn it over to Andrew and Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Professor Wagner, for your thoughtful remarks. A reminder to everyone in the audience, you can submit your questions via the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Gernot, let's start with a question from Alec, who's wondering about a coordinated policy response to climate change. He wants to know how we should think about states and cities in terms of passing climate policy versus federal regulation and a policy response federally.
Well, right about now, sadly, of course, the only real climate action is happening at the city and state level, right? Not much happening, at least not in a good way, currently at the federal level. So in many ways, it is mostly bottom-up policy, but still bottom-up as we speak. In a different world, what it would take, of course, is the right action at every level, right? Coordination, not just at the local, state, and federal level, but of course also at the international level, right? The Paris Agreement, by the way, is only a one baby step here, only a start of what actually should happen to make sure that we coordinate policy globally. And yeah, there are parallels to COVID here too, right? New Zealand might have done the right thing, limiting deaths to, I believe, 1 still to this date, which is amazing, right? Infections down to fewer than 10 new infections per day as we speak. So they haven't just flattened the curve, they've crushed it. Well, New Zealand might be an island, quite literally, but as soon as as soon as flights resume, as soon as it too opens its economy, well, it also depends on what happens around it. It takes coordination at the international level to make sure that individual countries don't just simply open the floodgates to, frankly, abject policy failures elsewhere.
Along those same lines, RP is wondering if there are any organizations you see as suitable for leading this international response and bringing together this coordination. Do you feel like certain organizations are better suited for that?
Well, frankly, it's tempting to go all the way to the UN almost immediately, right? And in a rational world, that's exactly where that coordination would happen, right? A collection of governments, national governments, trying to not debate whether the problem is real, but debating a solution. Frankly, we've been at this for 3 decades by now, and we haven't really gotten much done. Let's not debate whether the Paris Agreement itself was a success or a failure, but that too, of course, has limits. So surprisingly, maybe there are in fact organizations, collections of cities that have a real impact here. One organization is called C40. Used to be called it's still called C40. Used to be because it was 40 major cities, including New York. Mayor Bloomberg at the time was heavily involved in creating this. By now, it's many, many more cities. And yes, it is cities coordinating policy at the international level. Right, it's great that we have 300, 400 miles of bike paths in New York City. No, that alone isn't going to solve climate change either. But, well, if efforts like this, transportation, urban planning, and so on and so forth, are in fact coordinated at the international level, it could make a real difference. So, yes, it's coordination at the city level, state level, national level, and of course also civil society, NGOs, right? Which some of them are in fact very international themselves. And then there's plenty that are coordinating, organizing globally to figure out how to push their individual governments, their individual leaders to do the right thing.
Thank you. So you mentioned possible transit and urban planning reform. Abigail asks, what do you think the future of public transit looks like post-pandemic? Do you think this is an opportunity to push forward green policy initiatives in the arena of public transit?
Well, here's hoping, right? Frankly, I can't really see myself currently sitting in a metal tube, be it an airplane or a train for that matter. That's, of course, a completely different story, right? So, as usual, I could give you the good news story and I can talk myself into believing that. I can give you the bad news story and can talk myself into believing that. So, sitting here in our caves here, right, in my case, 800 square feet shared with 2 kids and my wife in the middle of everything, right? That sounded pretty darn good 6 months ago, or, still sounds pretty good to us, assuming we can go out and enjoy the middle of everything. Right. So, plenty of words have been written by now on how this will revolutionize work, telework. We will cut down on commuting. Sure, we will, probably, right? There was never really a reason to commute into Midtown Manhattan just so you can stare at a screen all day and then go home at night, right? Well, cuts down on commuting, cuts down on travel, which is good. What other effects could possibly happen based on that? Well, there's no reason to live in the middle of everything if you don't actually have to show up for work, right? You can be out in the burbs with a couple car garages, bedrooms, actual bedrooms, and so on and so forth. Which of course would lead to an increase in emissions, or sort of the extreme case, right? Commuting might suck. Well, travel is pretty fun. Again, it'll take a while, right? We need much more testing first, or ideally, of course, a vaccination before many of us who are not forced to do so will choose to travel again in trains or planes. That said, well, if and when that happens, and frankly, we don't have to show up on our job on the desk to work, well, you can work from home, or you can fly halfway around the world and work from a beach in January, right? You might have to get up in the middle of the night to dial into your Zoom meeting, but, well, that's only there to have even more time during the day to enjoy the beach or hiking or whatever it might be. And yes, that is, of course, is also associated with more emissions. So I'd like to think it's a good news story. There could be a good news story there. Frankly, I'm definitely afraid it may simply be a bad news story unless it's policy, government, institutions guiding us in the right direction there too.
Thank you. Let's switch gears to a number of economic questions that we've received. Louisa is wondering, do you worry that the incoming economic recession will push governments to relax environmental regulations in the name of economic growth? What policies do you think could be put in place to prevent this?
Well, in short, I do. I worry a lot about that, and of course, we already see that now, especially, of course, in this country, where, frankly, some environmental rule rollbacks that would have happened anyways are now happening under the guise being justified as economic stimulus of sorts. So that's certainly the case. Now, what could prevent that? Well, I mentioned Green New Deal before. Whatever we might think of that specific idea, and of course, it's not one thing anyways. It's lots of things to lots of different people. But really, what that encapsulates is this idea that a real stimulus, if and when we actually need that, right? So far we've spent $2+ trillion, not on a stimulus, really, on economic relief. Right, which is much needed right now. And the bill itself, even though headlines described it as a stimulus, that wasn't really the case, right? It wasn't meant to entice us to go back to work. It, frankly, speaking as an economist, it was meant to pay us to stay home, right? As still is the right economic, the right public health answer. Well, if and when we do need to go back to work, jumpstart the economy, that of course ought to happen with green goals in mind. Climate, of course, only being one of them, but frankly, in my book at least, the main one. So yes, that means heavy investment in clean, green, lean, mean infrastructure. Plenty of trillions of dollars to spend on that. And yes, we ought to be doing this with climate goals, clean public transport goals, and so forth in mind.
That relates to another question we received. Do you think policy, climate action included in such a stimulus would be controversial, or do you think climate issues would be sort of depoliticized and able to be like snuck in amidst larger policy?
Well, in this country right now, or in general. So let me put it this way. So right now, I would think that if there is one thing that COVID has taught us, it is to take science, facts, much more seriously than we have, at least at the federal level in this country, right? What does that really mean? Well, no, climate change shouldn't be controversial. Right, it's sort of mid-19th century science, right? Greenhouse effect. This is not scientific news here. We've known this for decades, right? Literally. And of course, frankly, many countries, states for that matter, even in this country, have acted accordingly. Well, the last 3.5 years or so in this country, that certainly hasn't happened. And I believe I just lost video, but if you can still hear me, my audio, I will keep speaking.
Yes.
Once. Okay, awesome. Oh, and video is back too. Okay, so yes, right. So, speaking of infrastructure investments or clean infrastructure investment, right? Once we can figure out how to have stable Wi-Fi in downtown Manhattan, maybe we can figure out climate change too. But actually, right, that's a good example of when you look at green infrastructure, how all-encompassing that truly is, right? High-speed internet in rural areas, forget about downtown Manhattan right now for a minute, but high-speed internet access, well, at the very minimum, right, if we are talking about commuting or less commuting, working from home, right, well, that certainly ought to be part of the answer to investment in public transport and so on and so forth. So back to the question, right, green stimulus, yes, of course, we have to, frankly, invest much, much more into this transition. Back to my very first point, right? Actual climate success doesn't look anything like what we are experiencing right now. It's not going back to our caves or lofts for that matter, but it's not being stuck home. It is more economic activity. It is more investment. And yes, green investment ought not be controversial. It's not green or brown or anything. It's just good economics. It's internalizing the externality, to use a dirty economic term, and doing so to address systemic risks in a broad way.
Thank you. We've received a number of questions asking you to provide any examples of some impactful measures you'd like to see governments undertake to invest in climate change mitigation and resilience. Are there a few policy measures that stand out above the rest that you think government should prioritize above others?
Well, I think a really big one, or there's lots of them, but infrastructure is, of course, front and center here, and not just high-speed internet or the second train tunnel from Manhattan over to New Jersey underneath the Hudson River. But let's just start with train infrastructure, right? Which, just to be frank, in this country is pathetic, right? Let's say it takes longer today by train from New York City to Chicago than it did when the first train went, right? So 80, 100 or so years ago. Why is that? Well, because nobody takes the train from New York to Chicago. We all fly if we need to go to Chicago from here in New York. What would it take? Well, Beijing, Shanghai is the exact same distance as New York, Chicago. Bullet train takes 4 hours or so, 3.5, 4.5 maybe, to go that same distance. That's what it takes here to go from New York to Boston, right? Which also is slightly pathetic. That's sort of the difference. So I'm originally from Austria. There are a couple, actually, two of the major cities in Austria, Salzburg and Vienna, are about the same distance as Boston, New York. Boston, New York on the fast train, on the Acela, is almost 4 hours. Salzburg, Vienna is something like 90 minutes. The difference is amazing, right? And of course, what does that mean? Well, yes, there's plenty of us who take trains between Boston and New York, but of course, flying is in fact faster. That is certainly not the case in Europe in many instances, and well, even a distance like Chicago, New York, same distance in China, you take the bullet train. Here you fly. So there's a lot of investment that needs to happen to truly transition to a low carbon, high efficiency economy. And that's a lot of money, right? Like there's the train tunnel right there, right? The one train tunnel from Manhattan to New Jersey, right? That's $10–15 billion easily. That's certainly where government comes in. That is certainly where we need to have green investment, massive stimulus spending, in fact, being oriented towards a transition toward a low carbon society.
So Shane has a good question in response to what you've been saying about all these different policy measures. How can we measure these policy actions? Do you think that cost-benefit analysis regarding climate change measures is the most effective way to decide on these actions? Or are we unable to properly evaluate the outcomes and impacts? And should we be using some other kind of calculation?
Well, I would say the benefit cost analysis intelligently applied certainly points into the direction of much, much more of these kinds of investments. And when I say intelligently applied, right, so there are limits here to benefit cost analysis. Back to Don Rumsfeld, right? What does benefit cost analysis capture? It captures the known knowns. It captures the stuff we can quantify. Now, where do the known unknowns end up? They end up in footnotes, right? And the unknown unknowns, of course, are in many ways anyone's guess. Now, unfortunately, in many ways, both those known unknowns and unknown unknowns, and possibly truly unknowables, point in one and only one direction when it comes to climate change. And that, of course, is of more action, right? We can, to get too mathematical here, but we can cut off the left-hand side of many of these distributions very quickly, right? We know that adding CO2 isn't going to decrease temperatures. So the left-hand side of these distributions we can cut off, at the very least at 0 or 1 degree, right? We've already warmed by that much, and so on. While on the right-hand side, the right tail of these distributions, we are not as lucky. Those are the known unknowns, the unknown unknowns. So back to benefit cost analysis, well, it captures the stuff we know, which on the climate benefit side is an underestimate, because most everything else that we can't quantify points in the direction of doing more. On the cost side, the cost of this green transition, the costs that are typically quantified in these benefit cost analyses are an upper estimate. Why is that? Well, because we look to current technologies, the stuff we know that works, put that into our equations, and estimate the costs. Meanwhile, of course, this transition will get cheaper over time. Right? Solar PV famously decreased in cost something like 80–90% in the past decade. Well, nobody predicted that 10 years ago. Right? We are still sort of behind in incorporating those vast cost decreases. The fact that we are climbing up the learning curve, sliding down the cost curve here, we are still behind incorporating those advances in our standard benefit cost analyses, speaking from personal experience here. So what does that mean? Well, whatever comes out of these benefit cost analyses, the price per ton of CO2 that we ought to be paying as a society is the bare minimum of what we need to pay. And now, depending on your perspective, fortunately or unfortunately, that price is so much higher than what we are currently, in fact, doing in terms of policy, that there's only one way to go. So yes, I would say benefit cost analysis ought to be at the core of our decision making, but it needs to be intelligently applied. We need to realize that there are real limits to these calculations, and that means when we need to make decisions on the uncertainty, and we always do, right? It's never, it's never sort of a game situation where you know precisely the parameters and you know precisely the probability of one thing happening or the other. We hardly ever do in the real world. We ought to keep those uncertainties in mind, which frankly means we ought to be doing, if anything, more than what those standard benefit cost analyses tell us, than less.
Thank you. So we've received a bunch of questions about framing, rhetorical framing of climate issues. In light of the coronavirus pandemic, how would you suggest politicians frame climate issues when they're speaking with the public, in debates, in advertisements? Does the framing of climate action shift as a result of everything that's going on?
Well, the short answer, it depends, right? It depends a lot on the context. Toyota is selling hybrid pickup trucks in certain states in this country deliberately without the hybrid label sticker in the back. Why? Well, why sell the hybrid? Well, because it's fundamentally a better vehicle. But, why rub it in, right? Why try to convey that this is something that's associated with a certain kind of politics, sadly often associated with that, that, wouldn't sell quite as well as, frankly, not emphasizing the clean energy, the energy efficiency, the climate angle. Of course, the exact same thing applies to politicians, to leaders making those points. And frankly, back to the COVID climate parallels, I can tell you many of us, I have failed to communicate the urgency of climate change, the exponential growth associated with climate change, in sort of any way, shape, or form that would actually lead to the kind of action that is necessary. And yes, I've tried over more than a decade by now with books, tweets, anything in between. It is really, really difficult to get these points across. What does that really mean? Well, right now, so it's sort of relatively simple at this point to point to the COVID climate parallels. That said, really, in many ways, the communication aspect of what's the problem, what are the solutions, ought to emphasize how climate too hits home already. It does. We know it does. Right? Wildfires in Australia, wildfires in California for that matter, more extreme weather events, all of the above, right? Every one of these events, many of these events can now be attributed to what's happening to, relatively slow increases in global average temperatures, lead to massive changes in the probability of these extreme events. And just, listening to myself say this just now, all of that sounds pretty nerdy, right? So that's, of course, the kind of messaging that one would use to a particular audience who associates, let's say, PDFs with probability density functions and not with what Adobe gives us, right? There's a certain kind of language you use for that. And then, of course, there is, public communication, what you would use in your Twitter feed if you have, if you ever reach beyond the little climate economic bubble, as it were. And yes, it depends. A lot depends on who your audience is. A lot depends on what to emphasize in the communication. I would just say at the end of the day, the main point in many of these instances is this isn't some touchy-feely green stuff, right? That, wouldn't it be nice if we were to do this? All of this, lots of these topics go to the core of addressing systemic risk, addressing the kinds of risks and uncertainties that, frankly, businesses, the finance sector, is often pretty good at incorporating when it comes to their own risks or uncertainties. What, of course, has happened for much too long vis-a-vis climate change is we are privatizing the benefits while socializing the risks. And businesses, of course, know that too. So unless they're forced by policy to also privatize the risks, incorporate the risks and uncertainties, well, they won't. So yes, it takes policy at the end of the day.
Do you think that any organizations or states are leading the way on pricing in risk of climate change? We've received a couple of questions asking, is anyone setting the trend that other states and cities and organizations can follow?
Well, in this country, California, in many ways, is one of the leaders here. They have fairly comprehensive climate policy in place. There's a cap and trade system that covers 85% of greenhouse gas emissions, prices carbon somewhere around $15 per ton. Is that enough? No, clearly not. It needs to be much, much more ambitious. But frankly, it's a lot easier to get from $15 to $100 than to get from 0 to 15. Right? So yes, I would point to California, and I guess proudly say that a fellow Austro-American, Schwarzenegger, signed that one into law. Europe is doing many the right things. So at the European Union level, there too are fairly comprehensive climate policies. Again, not ambitious enough, but there too, of course, right? It's a lot easier to get to from where they currently are to where they need to be than to get to from 0 to anywhere. And then, of course, there's individual countries, right? So as usual, you can always point to the Swedes, the country handing out the Nobel Prizes, right? Doing much, much more than the rest of us in many ways. Not on COVID, right? Not the Swedish model here of not locking down the economy on climate, where they've been pricing CO2 emissions since the early 90s, almost 30 years by now. Most of the rest of us have sort of barely understood what the problem was back then. Well, they had a fundamental tax reform, getting down marginal tax rates from as high as 80, 90%, and taxing bad instead of taxing goods. Well, that sort of tax reform happened in the early 90s in Sweden. It ought to happen everywhere. And of course, climate policy needs to go well beyond these sorts of taxes. And there are plenty of other countries, Germany on the subsidy front, on the consumer side, probably sticks out as a positive example. Frankly, China on the production side of solar panels sticks out on the subsidy front too. Because overall, the results are mixed in both countries, frankly. But yes, right, in many ways, one of the answers here is to brush up on German and Chinese and start writing thank you notes to German and Chinese households. They are subsidizing some of these advances for the rest of us.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Wagner, for taking the time out of your schedule to talk with us today. Looks like we have time for one more question. Can you offer up some advice to students and climate activists in the audience? Is there an action item that individuals can take to make a difference on climate during this time? Are there publications they should read or organizations they should look to how can we all make a difference?
Well, let me go back to one of the economic concepts that, in fact, will clearly survive whatever is happening right now in the real world. Comparative advantage. Sounds pretty nerdy, but really what it means is let's do where we have whatever it is that really have the biggest impact, right? So that means, teachers teach, students study, leaders lead, and so on and so forth. But really what that means is, right, there is no one answer. Of course not. There's no silver bullet, right? There may not even be a silver buckshot here. It is basically going to do the kinds of things where we think we do have the biggest impact, or the specific publications, specific organizations. I would say, there's lots of them that are very effective at what they do. Maybe just a quick plug for my past employer, where I spent almost a decade, Environmental Defense Fund, as one of many environmental groups that is doing fantastic work when it comes to finding the kinds of solutions. Actually, the tagline is finding the ways that work, right? Making things happen. Lots of other groups, of course, too, that are doing fantastic work. But at the end of the day, I think climate, especially something like climate, really what sticks out is that there is no one thing, right? There is no one, here are the 3 things you can do to save the planet. Right? Well, if there is, it's basically vote, vote, and vote, right? And we certainly ought to be doing that too. So yes, go out and not, single-mindedly focus on climate all the time for everything, right? Right about now, I spend more time worrying about how to apply climate insights to COVID as opposed to the other way around. Well, sooner rather than later, we'll be going back to doing the opposite too, of course. And yes, it's a broad area of things that ought to happen, that ought to guide policy in the right direction of ending here with a nerdy economic term, internalizing the externality, making sure that we stop socializing the costs while privatizing the benefits.
Thank you, Professor Wagner, for your thoughtful remarks. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you in the future at other NYU Wagner events.